Some decisions don't explode immediately, they unravel slowly. One CEO abandoned his pregnant wife at midnight, convinced the choice would protect him. Instead, her quiet transformation revealed a truth he couldn't escape. This story isn't about betrayal alone. It's about how walking away from someone vulnerable can shatter the very identity you're trying to save. Everyone thought this marriage was stable, until it collapsed without a sound. From the outside, Daniel Whitmore's life appeared engineered for permanence. As a CEO, he was known for discipline, foresight, and emotional containment, a leader who rarely reacted and never rushed. His decisions carried weight because they were measured, and his reputation rested on consistency rather than charisma. People trusted him not because he was loud, but because he was predictable. Stability followed him like a shadow, reinforcing the belief that his personal life was governed by the same control. Claire Whitmore stood beside that image with a quieter presence that felt intentional. Pregnant and grounded, she carried herself with a calm that suggested certainty rather than performance. Her identity had grown around partnership, not dependency. She had chosen a life that prioritized alignment over recognition, believing that shared direction mattered more than individual spotlight. Those close to the couple described her as steady and thoughtful, someone who absorbed uncertainty without complaint. Her pregnancy was received as a natural continuation of a life already assumed to be secure. Their marriage was often described as mature and dependable, built on mutual respect rather than volatility. There were no public conflicts, no whispered scandals, no visible fractures. They moved through social and professional spaces with ease, projecting cohesion without explanation. Observers read their quietness as confidence, their restraint as trust. In a culture accustomed to spectacle, their composure felt reassuring. The assumption was simple: relationships like theirs did not break. They evolved. The pregnancy reinforced that assumption. It was framed as continuity, a confirmation that everything was proceeding as planned. Family members spoke about legacy, colleagues smiled at the symbolism, and acquaintances relaxed into certainty. A child, after all, suggests commitment. It implies future. No one considered that pregnancy can also expose fault lines, that vulnerability can magnify distance rather than close it. The narrative did not allow for that possibility. Privately, however, emotional distance had been growing quietly. Daniel's presence became functional rather than connective. He fulfilled responsibilities but avoided emotional engagement. Conversations shortened. Reassurance thinned. He spoke about the future in abstract terms, careful not to commit to specifics. To outsiders, this read as focus. To Claire, it felt like something she could endure. She believed patience would restore closeness, that momentum would eventually slow and bring them back together. Early signs of detachment were mistaken for ambition. Long hours, late nights, and increasing silence were justified by growth and pressure. Daniel never expressed dissatisfaction. He never raised his voice or crossed obvious lines. His withdrawal was subtle, nearly invisible. Control masked discomfort. Logic replaced emotion. The marriage continued, supported by habit and assumption rather than intention. Claire's patience filled the space Daniel left behind. She adjusted expectations, softened needs, and convinced herself that endurance was a form of love. Pregnancy intensified her focus on stability, reinforcing her belief that continuity mattered more than confrontation. She trusted the history they shared. That trust delayed recognition. Emotional safety eroded quietly, not through betrayal, but through absence. Daniel experienced the shift differently. Success altered how he processed responsibility. Emotional complexity began to feel inefficient, unpredictable. Pregnancy introduced variables he could not optimize. Instead of anchoring him, it unsettled him. He did not articulate this fear. He compartmentalized it. Silence became strategy. Avoidance felt clean. Decisions made without discussion felt controlled. The marriage appeared unchanged to everyone watching. Routine continued. Appearances were maintained. The structure held. But the foundation thinned. What sustained the relationship was no longer connection, but inertia. The difference was subtle but decisive. Without emotional reinforcement, stability becomes fragile, even if it looks intact. Midnight approached without warning. There was no argument leading up to it, no dramatic escalation. The house remained still, the routine unbroken. Claire slept believing the next day would resemble the last. Daniel stayed awake, not conflicted but resolved. Decisions formed in silence often feel easier to the one making them. He had already reframed the marriage as an obstacle rather than a partnership. What remained was timing. When Daniel left, the absence was deliberate. No note, no message, no explanation. The quietness of the act made it feel absolute. Control extended even to departure. Midnight ensured confusion would replace clarity. Delay would replace confrontation. He believed distance would simplify consequence. Claire woke to silence that felt wrong before it made sense. The absence was immediate and disorienting. There was no context to soften the shock, no language to anchor reality. Pregnancy amplified the impact, turning uncertainty into physical instability. Her identity, rooted in partnership and future, fractured instantly. What she had believed was stable vanished without warning. What no one saw coming was that Daniel had already decided to leave, without explanation. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He disappeared. Midnight carried a precision Daniel Whitmore understood well. It offered control without confrontation, distance without accountability. The hour itself felt designed to blur edges, to postpone questions until daylight could dilute urgency. Leaving at midnight meant fewer witnesses, fewer interruptions, fewer demands for clarity. It allowed him to act while the world slept, believing silence would soften consequence. In that quiet, he convinced himself the decision would feel clean. Daniel moved through the house without urgency, careful not to disturb routines that no longer felt mutual. The stillness suited him. It reinforced the idea that departure could be orderly, even considerate. He told himself that confrontation would only complicate matters, that explanation would invite negotiation. Avoidance felt efficient. Control felt intact. He chose absence because it required nothing in return. The door closed without ceremony, and the night absorbed the sound. There was no note left behind, no message timed to arrive later. No language attempted to frame the act. Daniel believed explanation would create obligation, and obligation would weaken resolve. Silence, by contrast, preserved authority. He imagined clarity would come later, that distance would transform shock into understanding. In his mind, leaving quietly was a form of restraint. He underestimated the violence of uncertainty. Pregnancy intensified everything Claire would soon experience. The body does not separate emotional rupture from physical reality. The shock would not arrive as a thought alone. It would arrive as dizziness, confusion, and an immediate sense that the ground had shifted. Daniel did not calculate that cost. He focused on his own relief, the sense that an unsustainable pressure had been released. The quietness of the night reinforced his belief that he had minimized harm. Abandonment does not require force. It requires removal. Daniel exercised control through silence, believing that absence would reduce conflict. He told himself that Claire would understand eventually, that timing was unfortunate but necessary. Midnight made the act feel temporary, as though daylight could still correct what darkness allowed. He did not consider that timing communicates intention more clearly than words. Claire woke to a house that felt unfamiliar before it felt empty. The quiet was wrong, heavier than rest. She noticed the absence in fragments, a missing presence where routine expected one. Confusion arrived first, then fear, then the sharp realization that something irreversible had occurred. There was no explanation to follow, no context to steady her. The absence spoke for itself, and it spoke loudly. Pregnancy destabilized her response immediately. Questions collided with physical vulnerability. The future she had organized around partnership collapsed into uncertainty. Identity, once anchored in shared direction, fractured. The silence offered no reassurance, only speculation. Each unanswered possibility widened the rupture. The lack of explanation made the abandonment feel complete, intentional, and final. Daniel imagined the quiet would buy him time. He believed that leaving without words would prevent escalation, that space would allow rational processing. He framed his decision as protective, for both of them. In reality, he protected only himself. Silence shielded him from immediate discomfort, but it also removed any chance of consent or understanding. Control, once exercised, became isolation. As dawn approached, Daniel felt the steadiness he had anticipated. The city resumed its rhythm. Work awaited. Structure returned. He mistook routine for resolution. The absence of confrontation reassured him that the decision had been executed cleanly. He did not anticipate the reach of what he had done, nor the permanence of the message timing delivered. For Claire, morning did not restore order, clarified loss. The daylight revealed nothing new, only the same unanswered questions. Without words to interpret, she was left to assemble meaning from absence. The shock settled into awareness. Her sense of self, built around stability and future, destabilized instantly. The house felt larger, colder, less certain. The silence did not pass. It entrenched. Daniel believed leaving would protect him from emotional reckoning. He assumed distance would simplify consequence, that time would neutralize impact. He did not recognize that abandonment multiplies meaning when explanation is withheld. The midnight exit did not end the story. It began a transformation he could not control. The quiet departure created a narrative neither could rewrite. For Claire, it marked the moment identity split, forcing reconstruction under pressure. For Daniel, it set consequences in motion that would not remain private. Silence had done its work. Control had been exercised. The cost had not yet arrived. But Daniel believed leaving would protect him. He was wrong. When he left, he didn't just abandon her, he erased who she thought she was. Claire Whitmore had built her sense of self around continuity, the belief that partnership meant shared direction even during uncertainty. Her identity was not dependent, but it was intertwined. She understood herself as part of a future that required coordination, compromise, and trust. That framework had guided her decisions for years, shaping how she measured stability and meaning. When Daniel disappeared, the framework collapsed instantly, leaving nothing in its place. Pregnancy magnified the rupture in ways Claire could not prepare for. The body responds to emotional shock without permission, translating confusion into physical vulnerability. What might have felt disorienting under different circumstances became destabilizing. Her routines lost coherence. The future she had visualized dissolved without explanation. The absence forced her to confront a reality she had never rehearsed: survival without context. The mind searches for answers when identity fractures, and without them, doubt rushes in to fill the space. Loss of emotional grounding arrived before grief. Claire struggled to orient herself within the present, unsure how to interpret the sudden emptiness. The house felt unfamiliar, not because of its size or silence, but because it no longer reflected intention. Every object carried expectation that no longer applied. The lack of explanation amplified confusion, turning simple questions into sources of anxiety. Without language to interpret what had happened, she was left with speculation, and speculation erodes confidence quickly. Confusion gradually transformed into self-doubt. Claire revisited past moments, searching for signs she might have missed. She questioned her judgment, her patience, her interpretation of stability. The absence of answers invited internal blame, even when no evidence supported it. Identity, once rooted in partnership, now floated without anchor. The mind seeks responsibility when control disappears, and Claire felt herself absorbing questions that did not belong to her. Isolation deepened without resolution. Friends offered presence, but not explanation. Family expressed concern, but not clarity. Without Daniel's voice, the narrative remained incomplete. The lack of closure prevented grief from settling into understanding. Pregnancy heightened the sense of exposure, making every decision feel heavier. Claire recognized that she was navigating not just abandonment, but invisibility. The absence of acknowledgement felt as destabilizing as the departure itself. The emotional collapse was internal, not dramatic. There were no scenes, no confrontations, no release. Instead, the breakdown unfolded quietly through exhaustion and uncertainty. The absence of physical harm did not lessen the psychological impact. Claire's thoughts narrowed toward immediate survival, prioritizing safety and stability without knowing what those terms now meant. The mind adapts quickly under pressure, but adaptation requires reference points. Claire had lost hers. An internal conflict emerged between survival and betrayal. Part of her wanted to stabilize quickly, to protect the future forming within her. Another part struggled to reconcile trust with reality. The two impulses competed, creating tension without resolution. Betrayal demanded acknowledgement. Survival demanded focus. Claire learned quickly that clarity would not arrive from outside. It would have to be constructed. The beginning of identity reconstruction did not arrive as strength, but as necessity. Claire recognized that waiting for explanation would prolong instability. She began shifting attention toward what could be controlled. Routine, health, predictability. These small anchors provided temporary grounding. Identity did not rebuild itself immediately. It began forming around function. She discovered that continuity could exist without partnership, even if it felt unfamiliar. Pregnancy reframed priorities decisively. Claire redirected emotional energy toward preparation rather than interpretation. This shift did not eliminate pain, but it reduced its dominance. The future, though altered, still required intention. Identity reconstruction began quietly, not through declaration, but through action. Each decision reinforced autonomy, even as grief lingered. Claire did not yet understand the scope of what was happening. She believed she was simply enduring loss, unaware that transformation was underway. Identity, once fractured, does not always return to its original shape. Sometimes it reforms stronger, more defined by boundaries than expectation. The absence that erased her former self was creating space for something else. What Claire didn't realize was that her identity was about to transform, powerfully. Walking away felt powerful until the consequences followed him. Daniel Whitmore returned to work as if the night had been a logistical adjustment rather than a rupture. Meetings resumed, emails were answered, and decisions were made with the same efficiency that had always defined him. He relied on structure to restore equilibrium, believing routine could absorb disruption. In familiar spaces, authority returned quickly. People responded to him the way they always had, and that response reinforced his belief that silence equaled closure. Daniel framed emotional detachment as logic. He told himself that stepping away without explanation prevented escalation, that distance allowed clarity to emerge without damage. He believed that by avoiding confrontation, he had contained harm rather than created it. The narrative felt orderly. It spared him from difficult conversations and delayed reckoning. Control, in his mind, remained intact because the outcome appeared stable on the surface. Guilt surfaced only in fragments, and Daniel suppressed it with productivity. Discomfort was inconvenient, and he treated it as noise to be filtered out rather than information to be examined. He rationalized the decision through internal justifications, rehearsing explanations he never intended to share. The marriage, he concluded, had become unsustainable. Leaving quietly had been necessary. These narratives insulated him from doubt, allowing certainty to harden without scrutiny. Control was mistaken for strength. Daniel believed composure indicated maturity, that restraint signaled wisdom. He interpreted his ability to move forward as evidence of correctness. The absence of immediate consequences reinforced that belief. Without confrontation, he assumed resolution had been achieved. The problem, as he defined it, was no longer present. He did not recognize that absence can be more demanding than conflict. The first signs of psychological unease arrived subtly. Focus wavered during moments that previously felt automatic. Thoughts returned to the night unexpectedly, not as memory but as interruption. He dismissed these intrusions as temporary stress. Pressure accompanies leadership, he reminded himself. Adjustment takes time. The explanation fit neatly within his existing framework, and so he accepted it without challenge. Avoidance of accountability became routine. Daniel avoided questions that might invite reflection, steering conversations toward metrics and outcomes. He preferred environments where performance spoke louder than personal context. Accountability, when framed emotionally, felt unproductive. He chose distance over dialogue, believing that clarity would emerge without engagement. The strategy worked professionally. Privately, it began to fail. Internal justification narratives grew more elaborate. Daniel reframed events to preserve coherence, casting himself as rational rather than avoidant. He emphasized inevitability, convincing himself that the decision had been reached long before midnight. This reframing reduced uncertainty but increased rigidity. Each repetition reinforced the same conclusion, leaving no room for alternative interpretation. The mind seeks consistency under pressure, and Daniel provided it. Yet the illusion of control began to crack under its own weight. Silence did not remain neutral. It accumulated meaning. Daniel noticed how the absence followed him, shaping perception even when unspoken. Moments of quiet became charged. He recognized the sensation but refused to name it. Naming would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement threatened the narrative he depended on. He underestimated the permanence of the act. Leaving without explanation had not ended the relationship. It had transformed it into something undefined and unresolved. Control depends on boundaries, and by removing language, Daniel removed containment. The uncertainty he had imposed began returning to him in subtler forms. Confidence no longer felt seamless. Composure required effort. Daniel's belief that silence equals closure rested on a flawed assumption, that understanding follows distance. In reality, distance without explanation multiplies interpretation. He sensed that something had shifted beyond his control, though he could not yet identify what. The absence no longer felt empty. It felt active, pressed against routine, resisted normalization. As days passed, Daniel noticed how easily his certainty fractured when unoccupied. The quiet moments exposed cracks logic could not seal. Control, once effortless, now demanded reinforcement. He responded by tightening routines, narrowing focus, and avoiding spaces that invited reflection. The strategy maintained appearance but weakened resilience. Strength built on avoidance does not adapt well to pressure. The illusion held just long enough to convince him he had succeeded. He believed he had navigated a difficult decision with discipline and restraint. He believed consequences would remain manageable and distant. He did not yet understand that consequences do not always announce themselves immediately. Sometimes they arrive as information. Then Daniel learned something about Claire that shattered his certainty. What broke her did not destroy her, it revealed her. Claire Whitmore's reconstruction did not arrive as a declaration or a confrontation. It unfolded quietly, shaped by necessity rather than intention. In the absence Daniel created, she discovered space she had never been asked to occupy alone. At first, the silence felt disorienting. Over time, it became instructive. Without partnership to lean on or explain herself to, Claire began redefining who she was beyond the marriage that had once framed her entire sense of direction. Pregnancy, instead of weakening her, became a grounding force. The physical reality of it anchored her to the present, demanding attention and care. Where uncertainty once scattered her thoughts, responsibility now narrowed focus. She learned quickly that survival required predictability. Small routines provided stability. Planning replaced waiting. Each deliberate action restored a measure of control that abandonment had stripped away. The future no longer depended on reconciliation or explanation. It depended on preparation. Emotional clarity emerged not as relief, but as recognition. Claire began distinguishing between what had been lost and what had never truly existed. She stopped replaying the past in search of alternative outcomes and redirected attention toward what was within reach. This shift did not erase pain, but it reduced confusion. Understanding replaced speculation. She accepted that silence was itself an answer, and that clarity does not always require confirmation from the person who caused the rupture. Independence formed quietly, without announcement. Claire did not frame it as rebellion or empowerment. It was practical. She made decisions alone because there was no one else to consult. Over time, that necessity reshaped confidence. She trusted her judgment again, not because circumstances improved, but because reliance had shifted inward. Identity, once tethered to partnership, reoriented around competence and continuity. Strength expressed itself through restraint. Claire chose not to publicize her experience or seek validation through exposure. Silence was not submission. It was control reclaimed. By refusing to perform her pain, she preserved dignity. Observers noticed the absence of accusation more than any statement could have achieved. Her composure reframed the narrative, turning focus away from spectacle and toward substance. Stability became her language. Dignity through silence altered perception. Without commentary, the story settled into behavior rather than interpretation. Claire's actions conveyed intention clearly. She was moving forward, not negotiating backward. This refusal to engage publicly did not minimize what had happened. It clarified it. Silence eliminated distortion. It allowed reality to stand unfiltered. In doing so, it shifted how others understood both her and Daniel without her needing to speak. Identity rebuilt itself through stability rather than reaction. Claire established boundaries that protected consistency. She focused on health, environment, and predictability, elements that restored trust internally. The reconstruction did not aim to replace what was lost. It aimed to redefine what mattered. Partnership was no longer the foundation of selfhood. Responsibility, clarity, and self-trust took its place. There were moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly. Transformation does not erase memory. Yet even in those moments, Claire recognized progress. Pain no longer dismantled function. It informed it. The future, once imagined collaboratively, was now constructed deliberately. Each decision reinforced autonomy. Identity became less about alignment with another and more about alignment with reality. This transformation was not dramatic, but it was complete. Claire did not become someone new. She became someone revealed. The identity that emerged was grounded, resilient, and unambiguous. It did not rely on affirmation or explanation. It existed independently of Daniel's presence or absence. That independence carried weight precisely because it was unforced. What Claire did not anticipate was how visible this transformation would become. Her stability contrasted sharply with the silence Daniel had relied on. The clarity she embodied highlighted the ambiguity he had created. Without accusation, without contact, her progress communicated consequence. Identity reclaimed does not need confrontation to be understood. And this transformation became impossible for Daniel to ignore. Her growth exposed the man he had been avoiding. Daniel Whitmore did not encounter Claire's transformation through confrontation or announcement. It reached him indirectly, through absence that no longer felt empty and through accounts that described steadiness rather than collapse. He expected disarray, a pause that would justify his decision. Instead, he sensed continuity without him, a progression that did not require explanation. The contrast unsettled him because it challenged the narrative he had built to preserve control. Daniel had relied on control to define himself. It shaped how he led, how he decided, and how he exited. Control promised order and minimized exposure. Claire's resilience introduced a variable he could not manage. Where he had exercised silence to contain consequence, she had used structure to restore stability. The comparison was unavoidable. Control had produced distance. Resilience had produced clarity. The difference made Daniel question which quality truly represented strength. Privately, Daniel's reputation began to shift in ways he could not trace to any single source. No accusations surfaced publicly, yet conversations grew careful. Colleagues asked fewer personal questions. Associates noticed the absence he had assumed would remain invisible. Reputation, once anchored to predictability, now carried uncertainty. The lack of explanation that had protected him initially now raised doubts. Silence, when paired with visible contrast, invites interpretation. Interpretation is rarely neutral. The identity conflict intensified. Daniel's self-image depended on coherence, the belief that his choices aligned with logic and necessity. Claire's progress undermined that alignment. If she was stable, then his justification weakened. If she had adapted without him, then his role in the future he feared became questionable. The story he told himself began to fracture, revealing inconsistencies he had ignored. Control no longer felt like wisdom, it felt like avoidance. Guilt resurfaced through reflection rather than confrontation. Daniel did not experience it as remorse in the traditional sense. It arrived as irritation, distraction, and a growing sense of unease. Thoughts returned uninvited, challenging assumptions he had rehearsed into certainty. He dismissed these moments as temporary, yet they multiplied. Reflection resisted suppression. The more he avoided it, the more it demanded attention. An emotional reckoning took shape quietly. Daniel recognized that authority had insulated him from immediate consequence, but it had not eliminated accountability. Power had delayed exposure, not prevented it. Claire's independence highlighted the cost of his decision in ways no public criticism could. He had expected silence to dissolve responsibility. Instead, it preserved it, allowing it to mature without interference. Power no longer insulated him. The routines that once reinforced confidence now felt mechanical. Control required constant reinforcement. He narrowed focus, reduced vulnerability, and avoided spaces that invited introspection. These strategies maintained appearance but weakened resilience. The effort required to sustain composure revealed its fragility. Strength that depends on avoidance cannot adapt when confronted by reality. Daniel's self-image destabilized further as he recognized the limits of his narrative. He had framed departure as protection, believing he had minimized harm. Claire's reconstruction challenged that belief. Her stability did not absolve him, it exposed him. It suggested that his absence had not been necessary for her survival, only for his comfort. That realization disrupted the moral balance he had constructed. The contrast extended beyond private awareness. Without public statements or confrontation, the situation communicated meaning through behavior. Claire's restraint amplified the impact of Daniel's silence. The absence of accusation eliminated defense. It allowed observers to draw conclusions independently. Daniel felt the shift without seeing it. Authority eroded not through challenge, but through recalibration. As the weeks passed, Daniel noticed how easily his confidence fractured in unguarded moments. Control no longer restored certainty. It only postponed discomfort. The internal conflict grew more demanding, pressing him to reconcile intention with impact. He realized that avoidance had not simplified consequence. It had concentrated it. The reckoning he feared had not arrived publicly. It had arrived internally. Daniel attempted to restore equilibrium by doubling down on structure. He expanded schedules, increased productivity, and limited personal engagement. The strategy mirrored earlier patterns, but its effectiveness had diminished. Resilience cannot be replicated through control. The difference became clear as he recognized the effort required to maintain distance. What once felt effortless now felt imposed. The realization settled slowly but decisively. Claire's identity had not replaced his. It had reflected it back to him. The contrast revealed what he had deferred confronting. That control without empathy collapses under reflection. The absence he chose had not erased connection. It had inverted it. Consequence followed him not through exposure, but through awareness. What Daniel faced next was not public backlash, but internal collapse. Leaving someone vulnerable leaves a mark that never fades. Daniel Whitmore began to understand this not as an idea, but as an accumulation. The cost of his midnight exit did not arrive all at once. It gathered slowly, shaping his days through unease rather than accusation. What he had framed as a decisive act now lingered as an unresolved presence, pressing against moments that once felt neutral. Pressure did not create the damage. It revealed it. The long-term psychological impact surfaced in patterns Daniel could no longer dismiss. Concentration fractured under minor disruptions. Confidence, once automatic, now required reinforcement. He noticed a growing impatience with ambiguity, an urge to control conversations before they drifted toward personal terrain. The mind adapts to avoidance, but adaptation has limits. Daniel found himself rehearsing justifications that no longer settled him. The narrative he depended on had begun to thin. Fatherhood loomed without partnership, introducing a reality he had postponed acknowledging. The idea of responsibility detached from relationship unsettled him more than he expected. He had assumed distance would simplify roles, that separation would compartmentalize obligation. Instead, it magnified it. The future he had delayed now pressed forward without coordination, forcing questions he could not answer through logic alone. Preparation without alignment felt incomplete. Absence hardened into permanent consequence. What Daniel initially believed would remain temporary had established its own structure. Time did not dilute meaning. It clarified it. Each passing week reinforced the finality of the act. Silence became history. The possibility of explanation narrowed as distance widened. The longer the absence persisted, the heavier its interpretation became. What was not addressed transformed into identity. Power failed to repair damage. Daniel's resources could manage logistics and appearances, but they could not restore trust or coherence. Influence redirected attention, but it did not reframe memory. He recognized that authority, when used to avoid accountability, accelerates erosion rather than preventing it. Control proved effective in crisis but inadequate in consequence. The damage was not procedural. It was relational. Claire's stability contrasted sharply with Daniel's unrest. Her consistency, visible without commentary, amplified the imbalance he had created. She did not appear diminished by absence. She appeared defined by adaptation. That contrast sharpened his discomfort, not because it indicted him publicly, but because it confronted him privately. Stability achieved without him challenged the premise that his departure had been necessary or protective. Emotional accountability became unavoidable. Daniel recognized that justification no longer quieted reflection. The avoidance strategies he relied on lost effectiveness as awareness intensified. He could no longer attribute discomfort to stress or circumstance. The source was clear, even if acknowledgement remained difficult. Accountability did not arrive as confession. It arrived as recognition. The mind resists what the conscience insists upon. Identity inversion completed itself quietly. The traits Daniel once valued most, detachment, control, efficiency, now felt insufficient. The qualities he had underestimated, resilience, presence, restraint, proved durable under pressure. The inversion unsettled him because it destabilized hierarchy. Power without empathy lost clarity. Control without connection lost purpose. The values he had dismissed had endured. Daniel attempted to reassert equilibrium through structure. He increased commitments, narrowed focus, and insulated routine from interruption. The effort maintained appearance but deepened exhaustion. Control demanded constant vigilance. Resilience, he observed indirectly, did not. The difference weighed on him. Strength that requires reinforcement signals fragility. The realization lingered, uninvited and persistent. The pressure that followed did not break him. It exposed the cost he had deferred. Abandonment under vulnerability carries residue. It reshapes memory, expectation, and self-concept. Daniel felt the mark in subtle ways. Hesitation where certainty once lived, reflection where dismissal once worked. The cost did not announce itself. It accumulated until avoidance became unsustainable. As the future approached, Daniel recognized that the absence he chose had altered more than circumstance. It had altered alignment. Roles once assumed now required intention. Responsibility detached from partnership demanded acknowledgement. The pressure clarified what silence had obscured, that leaving without explanation does not end obligation. It transforms it. The contrast with Claire remained unavoidable. Her steadiness did not accuse him. It reflected him. The reflection carried weight precisely because it lacked judgment. It asked no questions and demanded no response. It simply existed, persistent and clear. Daniel understood that consequence does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as truth recognized too late. The cost of abandonment settled into awareness, steady and undeniable. What Daniel had avoided now stood fully formed. Distance had not protected him. It had prepared the reckoning. The mark he left had not faded. It had matured. The truth Daniel avoided now demanded acknowledgement. Some decisions don't end stories, they reveal them. Midnight was never just a time on a clock. It became a dividing line that redefined meaning. For Claire Whitmore, that night marked the moment her life stopped orbiting around expectation and began aligning with reality. For Daniel Whitmore, it exposed the limits of control he had mistaken for strength. What unfolded after that hour was not a continuation of conflict, but a clarification of character that neither could undo. Midnight functioned as a turning point because it stripped context away. There was no argument to analyze, no explanation to debate, no language to soften interpretation. The absence became the message. In that quiet, Claire understood that what had vanished was not just partnership, but certainty. The shock had fractured identity, but it had also removed illusion. With no narrative left to protect, truth surfaced unfiltered. The night did not destroy her. It simplified what mattered. Claire's identity was reclaimed fully through alignment rather than resistance. She did not replace what was lost. She outgrew it. Stability emerged from consistency, not reconciliation. The identity that formed was grounded in presence and responsibility, shaped by the clarity that survival demands. Pregnancy, once viewed as vulnerability, became a catalyst for focus. Claire no longer measured herself through shared future or withheld explanation. She measured herself through capacity, intention, and care. That recalibration held permanence. Daniel's identity, by contrast, dismantled gradually under reflection. The version of himself he had relied upon, decisive, composed, insulated, no longer fit the reality he faced. Control failed where empathy was required. Silence, once a strategy, became evidence. The certainty he felt at midnight dissolved as consequence matured. Authority could manage outcomes, but it could not reconcile meaning. The night he chose absence began unraveling the coherence of the self he believed he was protecting. Control revealed its limits through contrast. Where Claire adapted, Daniel resisted. Where she stabilized, he managed. The difference was not in effort, but in orientation. Control seeks to preserve image. Empathy seeks to preserve connection. The night demanded the latter. Daniel's reliance on the former exposed a deficit he could no longer ignore. The dismantling was internal and quiet, but it was complete. The identity he carried forward no longer aligned with the values the moment demanded. The story shifted from potential scandal to enduring lesson because of restraint on both sides. There were no public confrontations to distract from meaning. The absence of spectacle allowed the narrative to settle into clarity. Observers were not instructed what to think. They recognized what had occurred. Abandonment's true cost became visible not through accusation, but through outcome. Claire's steadiness contrasted with Daniel's unrest, reframing the entire event without commentary. Midnight did not mark an ending. It marked exposure. It revealed how decisions made in silence echo louder over time. For Claire, the echo became direction. For Daniel, it became reckoning. The difference lay in response. One aligned with reality and moved forward. The other attempted to preserve coherence without confronting cause. The night rewarded neither comfort nor certainty. It rewarded alignment. Abandonment's true cost emerged not as punishment, but as permanence. The mark did not fade. It informed. For Claire, the cost was transformation earned under pressure. For Daniel, it was the recognition that avoidance does not erase obligation. The night redefined responsibility, separating it from proximity and attaching it to choice. Parenthood, legacy, and self-concept all recalibrated around that understanding. The moral reflection extended beyond the couple. The story invited a broader question about power, vulnerability, and timing. It asked whether control can substitute for care, and whether silence can substitute for honesty. The answer arrived without instruction. The night demonstrated that empathy is not optional in moments of dependence. Where it is absent, consequence persists. What endured was not bitterness, but clarity. Claire did not carry the night as a wound. She carried it as a reference point. Daniel did not escape the night. He carried it as an unresolved measure. The difference shaped everything that followed. Some decisions imprint identity rather than resolve circumstance. Midnight did exactly that. That night, he didn't just abandon his wife. He abandoned the version of himself he could never reclaim. If stories like this make you pause and reflect on how quiet decisions shape entire lives, this channel is meant for you. These narratives aren't about noise or outrage. They're about understanding human choices under pressure. Staying connected here means continuing these conversations, one story at a time. And if you believe others should reflect on moments like this, sharing the story keeps its meaning alive.